Hello and welcome to my presentation today for Drupal GovCon. Very pleased to be able to be here virtually. Anyway, I'm currently in Australia in Melbourne. It's currently 2 a.m. in the morning. And today I'm going to talk about mobile accessibility, testing mobile sites and native apps. I'm the CEO of Accessibility Oz, and I was the chair of the two committees that developed these guidelines. Please put any questions that you have in your Q&A. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, but I think I'm good at multitasking, but I might not be. So hopefully I don't miss anything obvious. But if you put in all capitals, can't hear you, or something along those lines, I'll try to speak up or fix whatever technological difficulty we have. So thank you very much for coming, and let's get straight to it. So why did we develop this methodology? So the committees that developed this methodology for mobile sites and native app testing was convened from the ICT Accessibility Testing Symposium, which is a great conference that was in DC in October each year before COVID, and will be sometime in the fall of 2022, hopefully in person, but we'll see. And at the end of each conference, there'd be a discussion, what we'd call a town hall, which would say, where we'd say, what is it that we need to talk about? Like, as an industry of testing professionals, what is it that the industry as a whole needs? And one of the things that came out of that, of the 2017 conference, was that there was a real requirement for mobile accessibility testing requirements, that all the big players, the TPG, DQ, Level Access, Accessibility Oz, we all had our own mobile accessibility guidelines because we all knew that WCAG 2 didn't go far enough. But we wanted something that the entire industry could use. And so what we decided to do was convene a committee that would basically amalgamate these requirements. And that's what the first committee was about. And we were really aware that WCAG 2.1 was going to be released in June, the following year, June 2018. And so we were really hoping that this was a short-term issue, that we would make these mobile requirements. WCAG 2.1 would address everything that we were concerned about, and then we could all go our separate ways. So the first step was an amalgamation. But then when WCAG 2.1 came out, we found as a committee, we decided as a committee that we didn't feel that it went far enough. And so we reformed the committees, this time into two groups. One was native apps and one was mobile sites. And I was co-chair of both groups. And we wrote a series of very detailed guidelines, testing methods, etc., about mobile site and native app testing. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So why is mobile different to desktop? Let's just start with that. So mobile has a whole series of inbuilt accessibility features that are actually often part of desktop, or an application that you can download on desktop, but they're actually quite inherent to the device. So you don't tend to download a screen reader app on your mobile device. It comes packaged with a screen reader, which is not the case with Windows on me. Okay, there is Windows Narrator, but we can have a big discussion about that later on. So basically, there's a whole different kind of architecture that you have to be aware of. And so, you've got things like native screen readers, TalkBack on Android, Narrator on Windows for anyone that still has a Windows phone, VoiceOver on iOS. You've got things like volume control and haptic keyboards, visual, auditory, and vibrational notifications, text-to-speech, speech recognition, Zoom, etc. Now, all these things, the differences are that not that they're not available on desktop, but the people that tend to use them or investigate or download these features on desktop are very aware that they have a disability and they need these kind of additional requirements. Whereas these requirements in mobile are so inherent to the device that people who may not be aware that they actually have a disability are using them. For example, my stepmother, who has 20/20 vision with her glasses, she increases the text size on her mobile phone. So that's a kind of inbuilt feature, means that they're used by a lot more people, which means that you need to do a whole lot more testing because they can really mess some things up. Other system accessibility settings are things like font size, touch and hold delay, screen rotation, high contrast, assisted touch, and mono audio. So these things are what we all need to really look at and test with when it comes to mobile sites and native apps. So let's go back to WCAG 2.1. So WCAG 2.1 was released in June 2018. But before we talk about 2.1, let's talk about WCAG 2. So WCAG 2 success criteria are applicable to mobile. However, not all aspects of mobile accessibility are specifically covered by WCAG 2. For example, WCAG 2 requires that sites be fully accessible to the keyboard user. However, it doesn't specify that it should also be accessible to the touchscreen user. Now, WCAG 2.1 absolutely addresses this one requirement, and it has a bunch of criteria or a bunch of requirements around touchscreen, pointer gestures, sensors, and small screen devices. However, we really felt as a committee that it didn't go far enough. And one of the things that sort of the one example that I give, and if anyone says, well, tell me in 30 words or less why WCAG 2.1 doesn't go far enough in mobile, is talking about touch target size. So we've all had the experience that you use a mobile phone and the touch target is way too small, right? And if you can pinch zoom, that's great, but sometimes the system doesn't allow you to pinch zoom. So sometimes you just can't activate it. It's really annoying. Sometimes you hit something else instead. Now, that's annoying for all users, but it's especially difficult for people that have a physical disability. So it's something that we see and we understand as a community is a really important accessibility requirement. Now, there is a requirement for minimum touch target sizes in 2.1. However, it is relegated to AAA, which is what I like to say, the level where all success criteria go to die. Not many people attempt AAA requirements. There's some great things in AAA, but there just isn't enough sort of, I suppose, awareness maybe, or there wasn't enough time to go through these kind of requirements. And so we as a committee felt that WCAG 2.1 didn't go far enough. So yeah, I thought you might like that, Mike Herschel. It's sad, but it's true. Okay, so WCAG, he said AAA where success criteria go die, lol. Okay, so let's talk about WCAG 2.1 page variations. Now, this is actually a part of WCAG 2 as well, but this is a really good example as to why you can't assume someone looking at the mobile version of your site, if say it's a responsive site, is actually on a mobile. So low vision users, who use the zoom function inherent in the browser, like Control+, etc., are often restricted to the mobile view of the site on a desktop. Now, why is that? As part of WCAG 2, you must be able to zoom to 200% and still access all the functionality, not having overlapping, etc. That's part of WCAG 2 and very easy to test. However, often zooming to 200% triggers the screen size variation that makes the browser or the renderer think that it's a mobile device, and then therefore you'll get served the mobile version of the site. So for example, previously in YouTube, this has been fixed. Upload and notifications were visible at the 100% screen size, but not at the 200% screen size. So this means that people who are browsing on their desktop at 200% screen size couldn't upload or access their notifications. Now, why would YouTube set up a system where you increase text size and therefore you can't upload a video? Because they assumed that you were looking at it on a mobile device, and if you were going to upload, then you were going to use the YouTube app as opposed to a website. So this is what I mean. So here you've got a screenshot of the page at 100%, and in the top right, you can see upload and notifications that are visible. And then you increase it to 200% and they disappear. So this is why page variations are really important things to think about when it comes to mobile site testing. You really need to be able to test all your page variations, and you must have all functionality available on all page variations. Now, it can be hidden in some way, say under an expand or collapse or something like that, but you can't say, okay, well, we're not going to show the image gallery on mobile devices. We're not going to have this multi-page form available on mobile devices, because then you'll actually be excluding people who have low vision. Okay, so the other thing that you need to think about is the WCAG 2 and 2.1 accessibility supported requirement, which basically says that testing should be conducted with assistive technologies. Now, you can get away with not doing this when you're testing websites, desktop sites, because WCAG 2 kind of, does best guesses, right? Alt attributes for images, coded headings, etc. But because of the variation and the multitude of different mobile features on a mobile device, you really need to undertake that assistive technology assistive technology testing for native apps. Mobile sites, you can often get away with not doing it because you can at least look at the code. But with native apps, testers often don't have access to the code. And the only way to determine if, say, a field is properly labeled or an image has proper alternative is to actually use an assistive technology. Now, I just want to mention, I'm going through a lot of information here. This information is all available on the website. There's all of this information. You can also access a version of the webinar on our website, etc. So don't feel that you might be missing things. So this is just like a overview taste, and then you can read the documents and let us know what you think. The first thing to remember is that this methodology does not include those errors already included in WCAG 2, but it does include those errors in 2.1. So we wanted to capture people who say, hey, we want it to be mobile accessible, but we're only meeting WCAG 2. It's very clear in the document what's a WCAG 2.1 requirement. We reference WCAG 2.1, etc. But it's really, we didn't want to redo all the work that the W3C has done. So we don't require that images have alt attributes for etc. Because, that's already in WCAG 2. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So another thing I'd like to really get you to have you take away is that you must test with real devices and real locations, etc., etc. So back before COVID, BC, before COVID, I used to do a lot of travel because I used to do a lot of speaking. And it's a 15-hour flight from Australia to the US. That's a long time to be without internet, because when I started this travel, you could not get internet on long-haul flights. So, and we'd often sit in the tarmac for like an hour or so because, the gate wasn't open, depending on the winds across the ocean would depend on when we would arrive, etc. So I'd be sitting there in the tarmac with nothing to do, but I found out I could access the LAX Wi-Fi. So that was great. And then I found this. So basically, the LAX Wi-Fi has this great thing which says, hey, you can actually connect for 24 hours, etc., etc. But then it has this text that says, and I have to read closely because I need glasses, this page will redirect. So content doesn't really make sense to have here. And all of a sudden, I don't feel safe giving you my credit card details or my personal details, such as my email address. So how did this happen? Because someone was testing it on their desktop somewhere, and they never actually tested it in real life and determined that there was a pretty major bug. Not an accessibility issue, but a bug. Okay, so testing methods. How do we actually test mobile sites and native apps? So we determined that there were 4 main testing methods in mobile testing. First was to test with devices, so test on mobile and tablet devices. We do not recommend or really condone the testing using simulators. There's just so many problems with them. So get yourself some devices. Test with the assistive technologies and the mobile features on those devices. You also will need to test on a responsively sized window on desktop because there are some requirements around what's on desktop and what's on mobile. Who's on first? What's on second? That joke is way too old for me. Testing methods. So there are 2 testing methods in native apps because, of course, you don't access them on desktop and you can't access the code. And this is the devices and the devices with assistive technology. So there's basically the methodology for mobile site and native app is really, really similar. So basically the only thing that's different is the examples and the instructions throughout them, but the 5 steps are the same with the exception of step 2. So mobile site, step 1, identify devices. Step 2 for mobile site, identify site type and variations. Step 3, test critical issues. Step 4, test mobile specific issues. Step 5, test mobile assisted technology and feature support. Native app is exactly the same, except the second step is different. You, instead of testing variations, you define the application functionality. So I'll go into these in a little bit more detail. First is identifying devices. So we recommend the following devices and browser combinations if you're testing on mobile site: iPhone Safari, iPad Safari, and Android phone Chrome. Other devices to consider, things like an Android tablet or alternative devices such as a Kindle device. And when you're looking at those kind of devices, it's really worth, if you're looking at mobile sites, looking at your stats to see who is actually using it. So iOS devices are more popular in Western countries. Android devices are more popular in Eastern countries. So where your app and your site, who your app on a site is aimed towards, will inform what you should test with. We recommend testing on the latest version of iOS and the latest 2 versions of Android. However, I've found that testing just on the latest version of Android is often sufficient. However, if you have a site directly aimed at people with a particular kind of disability, such as Be My Eyes, which is where a vision impaired person holds up their phone to video the environment, and someone on the app actually describes it to them, so they can say, okay, well, you're 10 meters away from a traffic light, there's a fire hydrant in your way, etc., etc. That device is aimed at people with vision impairments, so you really want to do a whole lot of testing with the assistive technologies that those users will be using. So, and I don't mean just screen readers, but magnifiers, etc., etc. So if a site is aimed directly at a specific group, then test, of course, with that group. And of course, just in case I didn't emphasize it enough before, you need to meet WCAG 2 and this methodology. And WCAG 2 does apply to native apps as well. So, you have to do WCAG 2 first, or 2.1. So the second step is identifying site type and variations of the page for mobile sites. So is the site a desktop site, an M.dot site, or a responsive? And if the site is responsive, are there variations of the page? Now, most of the time, the sites will be responsive, but you do need to undertake this this test to determine it, because I was actually running mobile testing training for Stanford University, and they came across an M.dot site that no one knew actually existed. So even if your client or the people that you're working with say there is no M.dot site, there is no desktop site, you still need to actually look for them, because sometimes they get a big surprise. So what do I mean by this? Desktop sites, they have only one display, whether viewed on desktop or mobile or tablet devices. So think sites built, in the early 2000s. M.dot sites, they have a particular display for mobile and tablet, and they have a different display for desktop. Now, this is actually basically, you've got 2 separate sites, and these 2 separate sites have to be tested both on desktop and both on M.dot, because there are ways to access the M.dot site on a desktop, but there's also ways to access the desktop site on mobile. So you actually have to do a lot of testing if you have M.dot sites. And then responsive websites, which I said is most of them, they basically change depending on the screen size or other feature, and that's basically what you'll see most of. So here are the examples. This is the Australian National Botanic Gardens. This is the very first Australian website that ever went live. It currently has 49,000 pages because they have never taken a page down. I do not recommend this. So anyway, this is what their site looks like. And if you actually make the size of the window smaller, you can see nothing actually changes. It just gets narrower. You see less of it. So you drag the window smaller, you get a horizontal slide bar at the bottom. Versus something like a desktop versus M.dot site. This is Sephora, www.sephora. You've got navigation along the top. It's got 4 kind of sections. It's a very brown color. And if instead you replace the www with M, you get something that looks completely different. You've got the hamburger menu on the left-hand side. It's all very blue, etc. Now, if you go to a mobile device and you type www, on the left, you get basically what is essentially a desktop site. And on the right, you get what we saw as the M.dot site, but looks a lot better because it was created for a mobile width. But as I said, most of them will be responsive sites. And this is an example of a responsive site on desktop. This is the Accessibility Oz site. And as you can see, the navigation is along the top. You've got services in a row of 6 by 1. You make the window smaller, and the navigation turns into a hamburger menu. The services are 2 by 3, etc. So there's a whole lot of instructions on how to determine whether something's a desktop site or an MDOT site or a responsive site in the documentation. And the second step for native apps is define application functionality. So basically, you need to understand the purpose of the native app and determine what functionality is critical to the purpose and what is required for use. So for example, the Wells Fargo website has a lot of different uses, whereas the Wells Fargo mobile banking app has very specific uses. So they actually have very different test cases. So you need to ask the question, how would the experience be impacted if the functionality failed, the content could not be reached, or the experience caused a barrier to the user? And then you need to prioritize. So all functionality should be accessible within the native application. However, it's important to define and include the critical functionality for each individual app to be prioritized in your testing. And then, of course, you must test common elements that you see basically on all native apps. So navigation, landing screens, emergency sections, login flows, settings, account profiles, contact us, real-time updates, like your Uber has arrived, that kind of stuff, privacy policy, terms and conditions, interactional functionality, help sections, widgets, geolocational maps, and high traffic areas. Now, the next step is testing critical issues. Now, we identified a number of what we call traps on mobile devices. And we say a trap is basically where a user is trapped within a component and cannot escape without closing the browser or the app. Think of the keyboard trap in WCAG 2. You tab into a component, you can't tab out. That's a keyboard trap. You basically have to close the browser in order to escape a keyboard trap. And the same is with these traps. Now, we found there are many more traps on mobile sites and native apps. And this is probably because the mobile landscape is still quite immature in terms of what we're seeing. And we find that even in the last year or so, these traps have reduced greatly. So the first one I want to talk about is the exit trap. Ensure there is always an accessible actionable item, e.g. a close button that meets color contrast requirements and has an accessible name, that closes any feature that overlays the current page, such as a full page ad. This applies to all users, both methodologies. This is an example of an exit trap, where basically you have this ad that overlays the entire page, and there's no way to close that feature. You really have to close the app and start again. This is another example of an exit trap. So yes, you have a pop-up that says, hey, there's a fall sale, but the close button is so small, it doesn't meet touch target size requirements, and it doesn't meet color contrast requirements either. So it also is an exit trap. That's where the little close button is, by the way. Then we have swipe scroll traps. So ensure you do not override standard mobile touch functions such as swiping and scrolling on the majority of the pages. This applies to touch users and both methodologies. So this is an example here where you scroll to the bottom of the page and then you can't scroll up for some reason. Who knows why? The only way you can go further up the page is by hitting that very small button that doesn't meet color contrast, etc., etc., etc. Who knows why they do that? It's just the way of the world. This is what I like to call the Zoom of Doom. This is a very old example. I showed it in my first presentation in the US about mobile accessibility. So they definitely fixed this issue now. But this is where a map basically takes up the entire page. So if you try to swipe up and down the page, you actually swipe the map. You move the map around. So you have to hit these very small areas of white to actually scroll up and down the page, which is, impossible for some users. Then we have a text-to-speech trap. So, if the app has an ability to provide content via text-to-speech, the screen reader must a user must be able to pause or stop the app speaking in a simple manner, for example, by performing a swipe on screen. So this is an example here where, you hit play, you get the article read aloud to you, but there's no way to pause the article. You have to kind of somehow navigate your way to the pause button, which of course is very difficult if you're relying on a screen reader and the screen reader is speaking over the text-to-speech. Similar one is headset traps. So headset users must always be able to pause media, audio or video content by using the pause play control on the headset. Applies mostly to screen reader users and headset users, and both methodologies. So this is an example here. You've got this video that pops up in the bottom of the screen, and if you tap that little mute button, it will mute it. But if you're using a headset, if you hit the pause button on the headset and a screen reader, it will pause the screen reader, not that audio. And last, we have a layer trap. The user should not be trapped on a non-visible layer. This applies to all users, but it's mostly encountered by screen reader users. It's both methodologies. And basically, this is an example where you open the hamburger menu, but the screen reader user is trapped on the page underneath. And so they can't actually access any of the menu items or anything like that. So that's the last one. So I want to show you just an example of the document, and I have a lot more to say. But if you want to see a longer version, have a look at our website or read the documents. But basically, I want to show you that there's a lot of information available. So this is one of the requirements, which is touch gestures. Any touch gesture must have an alternative, accessible, actionable item. And this is very similar to 2.5.1 pointer gestures. So what is a touch gesture? Swiping up and down or left and right, dragging up and down or left and right, double tapping, tapping and holding, tapping and swiping, 2-pinch zoom, press and long hold. And the alternative accessible gestures must meet WIAC 2 or 2.1. They must meet change of state rules, touch target size rules, inactive space rules, native UI rules, removal of touch rules, which are all rules within the methodology. Examples of alternative accessible gestures are things like a link, a button, a drop-down, or a separate page with the same functionality. So each requirement has an about this requirement section, which I'll read aloud to you. This requirement is particularly important for screen reader users. For example, if you require your user to swipe right to complete a purchase when the screen reader is on, the swipe right gesture moves you to the next focusable item and doesn't complete the purchase. You must be able to perform the same action by using a link, an up or down swipe, or some other gesture. Please note that this requirement is similar to the exit trap requirement, but a failure of the exit trap requirement is that the user cannot escape from content or a page. The failure of touch gestures is that the user cannot choose content or a page. And then we have a section on how to test. So first off, you identify any site controls. If they require any of the following gestures, is there an accessible, actionable item provided as an alternative? Swiping up and down or left and right, or dragging up and down or left and right, double tapping or 2-pinch zoom, tap and hold or tap and swipe, press and long hold. And then we have an example. So here you have 2 rows of content, and you can tell that there is more content visible by swiping because the content is cut off on the side. So this is a very common indicator that there's more information. We actually have a requirement around this. But of course, if you can't swipe right, then that's basically useless. But you do actually have a link here that says see more. And so if activating that link will take you to a page that has all the content on it, which you don't have to access via swiping. Another example here is the weather on Google. And so you have a dragger that you can drag, from one date to another. But if you actually tap on any of the dates, then they actually activate, act as a link. So therefore that passes as well. So I just want to show you lastly where you can get them, and then we'll be up for questions. So you can go to the Accessibility Oz website, and under resources, you have the section mobile testing. And under mobile testing, you have the introduction, a little bit about that, and you have basically 5 documents under mobile site and 5 documents under native app. So the first document is the methodology, so whether that's mobile site or native app. The second document is about the testing. So, you know, devices, assisted technologies, site types, variations, capturing errors, etc. And then you have the critical test cases, the test cases, and the test cases for assisted technologies and mobile features. And so these are quite detailed. So if I show you the touch gestures example, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but this is the touch gestures requirement. You can see this is the requirement here. You've got an about section, you've got a section on exclusions, a section on how to test, and then a series of different examples. So you can see past examples and sort of see what you're looking for. So as I said, a lot of information there. Now, the last thing I want to mention is that we are actually reconvening the committee in the next month or so, and we're looking for anyone who is interested in being involved. Now, honestly, I know a lot more about mobile accessibility after being part of this committee than I did when I first started. If you're here and you're interested about it in accessibility, then you can help us. Don't feel that you need to be some kind of expert, because a lot of what we were doing was like, oh, they've got this new mode in iOS. Someone has to go off and figure it out. And sometimes we went out to specific experts, say on switch devices and things like that, to sort of say, okay, hey, how do people actually use this? So don't feel that you know, you can't help us. You can definitely help us. So please do contact us. I'll put it up after I talk to the Q&A, a way to contact us, and we'd love to have you involved. So I'm just going to take a breath, and then I'm going to answer the Q&A, of which I hope there's some. There's no Q&A. Well, if there's no Q&A, then I might just have to keep talking. I'll give people a couple of minutes. I do, as this is very, very fast, but this is all the other stuff that's in the presentation. As I said, there's a webinar that's available. So there's heaps of stuff to access. And basically, there's the information about joining the mobile committee. I'd love to get some questions. Mike Herschel, you're right. Those close buttons, they're notoriously inaccessible to everybody, simply because it's a dark UX pattern, right? They don't want you to close the overlay. They want you to buy, basically, is what they want to do. So no questions? Thanks, Mike. Mike's question is, if I have a wide div that's wider than the viewport and the content overflows, the user should be able to tab to get to the end items. Is this sufficient? Great question. I'm going to sort of put a caveat that I would probably need to see it in action to give you a definitive answer. But from what I understand, I think you're asking that basically you have items that are off screen, and you basically want the user to be able to, when they hit tab, to tab those items off screen. Now, absolutely, they should definitely be accessible via the tab order. Now, what you do need to do, though, is that when they are tabbed to, they need to be visible on the screen. So if it's, say, a carousel, and you know, you're tabbing to the next slide or whatever, that slide has to change visually. And I have written a very long article about creating accessible slideshows, and I know accessible slideshows were very 2015, which is when I wrote the article. But we do actually provide a free accessible slideshow if you want to use it on the Accessibility Oz website, if you have to deal with marketing who are just, you know, they just love their slideshows. So thanks for the question. Ali Seidel, similar to the small X close button, are there other examples of dark UX that are particularly negative re-accessibility? Ali, I could talk about this all day. I could write an entire presentation on it. anything that is a dark pattern or dark UX is inherently bad for accessibility, because basically what you're doing is or what you are doing, no one on this call is doing this, what people are doing are making it difficult in some way or other to basically take the path that you want to use. Now, that will mean that anyone who has a particular type of, there will be people that have particular disabilities who, therefore, it makes the path impossible. So, you know, if you think about grey on grey, for example, that's going to be really hard for people who are colorblind. Small touch target sizes, that's going to be really hard for people that are using a head wand, etc. So dark UX is notoriously bad for accessibility. And I think I know what my next article is going to be about. Scott Nelson, with regard to responsive web pages, are YouTube embeds accessible, or is it better to link to the video or other? I have a whole presentation on this too, Scott. Okay, so I have plenty of time. Okay, so I started Accessibility Oz 10 years ago, and trust me, I'm getting to the answer. And we always found all video players were inaccessible, right? They were just terrible. I mean, this was 10 years ago. And so we'd do these audits and we'd say, your video player is inaccessible. And they're like, oh, but it's YouTube. And we're like, yeah, we know. So we actually ended up building a video player called OzPlayer. And we had a lot of difficulty trying to convince people that, like, you know, these things really are inaccessible. And there's so many out there, right? And all they have to say is say, hey, we're accessible. And, you know, no one's going to test 37 different video players. So that's what we did. So we did it for a few years, probably about 6 or 7 years. We tested all the video players we could find. And we did it for, as I said, I think we did it 5 times, but consistently there were only 2 video players that met all accessibility requirements, and that was OzPlayer, surprise, surprise, but also AblePlayer. And they are the only 2 fully accessible video players around. However, having said that, YouTube is much better than it was 10 years ago. So it is, you know, if you want to embed YouTube, that's fine. You really need to embed something that supports audio descriptions, which YouTube doesn't do at the moment. But in answer to your question, Scott, see, I thought I'm going to get to the answer. In answer to your question, it is much more accessible to embed the video on your site than it is to send it to YouTube, send people to YouTube. And the reason why is because YouTube has this thing called an autoplay feature. And autoplay is one of the 4 non-interference clauses of WCAG 2. Now, I haven't looked at YouTube recently, but the last time I did, it was inaccessible, and I would expect that it probably hasn't changed. I mean, I looked at it like 2 months ago, probably hasn't changed. The autoplay feature, yes, it can be turned off by users, but it's very difficult for users to find it. There's no kind of concrete overarching setting in the profiles page that you see in Twitter or anything like that that can turn off autoplay. There's a whole bunch of problems with the autoplay. But the other thing that's really interesting is if you just play a video, you have autoplay turned off, you will find that it plays an ad, it plays the video, and then it plays 2 more ads, and then the video stops. Now, that's not the same experience as someone who can actually navigate through the video player and pause things and things like that. So there's a big problem with YouTube. I mean, once again, it's a dark UX pattern. You know, they want people to keep watching their ads and their videos and stuff like that, but much, much more accessible to embed videos in your site. Even using a slightly inaccessible video player like YouTube, but we'd of course prefer you to use OzPlayer. It's free for most people. Look it up on our website. Mike Herschel says the accessible slideshow article. Okay, so I can show you where that is. If you go to our site and you go to resources and then articles, we have slideshows. So we have this article 2015. I remember the date. The unbearable inaccessibility of slideshows, which is a dev article. However, the actual product itself is the Accessibility Oz slideshow. And you can get the code on GitHub, reference to the article, and you can see operational versions as well. And Mike, thanks, you saved me, Mike. Can you talk about prefers reduced motion and what, if any, animation is permitted when people have that turned on? Now, Mike, I really hope you join this committee because you are switched on. I have not been able to find any website, even the ones like Google and Apple, that actually maintain the reduced motion feature. So you turn on the reduced motion feature, and I cannot find any website that actually, honors that requirement. So it's a difficult thing. I would say it's not that you can't have motion, it's that the difference on the apps, for example, on Apple, is if you turn on reduce motion, then the apps, you know how you can swipe up and you can swipe through, and they kind of just do this kind of like rolling app after app after app. With reduced motion, it's very much a pop app, like there's no kind of like rolling motion. So I would say that Apple probably do know what they're doing around this, and so that you can have motion, but I would stick to sort of WCAG 2 requirements around that, which is that you can't have any motion that lasts for longer than 5 seconds. So I think that maybe having something that sort of plays for 5 seconds and then you can press play and play it for another 5 seconds would be a great way to do that. So yeah, I think that's probably the best thing. And I mean, this is hard with the whole Giphies that are floating around that just repeat and repeat and repeat. That was another article I was going to write because they can be really, really distracting. I do have a friend who has dyslexia and ADHD, and he finds that even the repetitive motion on, say, the Netflix homepage, I don't know, I haven't seen it lately, but maybe they listen to him. But basically, when you first go to Netflix, it just sort of plays a video, like there's no audio, but it's like almost like one of your shows is started playing in the background. He found that movement, which was, of course, there was no way to turn off, so distracting that he could not choose an option. So the preferred reduced motion is really about helping people who have ADHD, who find that kind of continuous movement really, really distracting. So I hope I answered your question there. We've got 3 minutes to go. I am going to put my email in the chat. Please feel free to get in contact with me if you have any questions. If you have any questions about the committee, Mike, I hope to hear from you because we need as much help as we can get. And one thing I want to say is that Accessibility Oz is a W3C member. I spent 6 years with the W3C contributing to WCAG 2 as an invited expert in the early 2000s. We're not trying to sort of steal the W3's thunder, but a lot of people aren't aware, but WCAG actually started as an industry peer kind of review committee. So exactly like this mobile committee, a bunch of before the W3C existed, a bunch of accessibility specialists came together and wrote basically what was WCAG. And then the W3C, with their assistants, co-opted it and created WCAG 1, which is one of the reasons why WCAG 1 only took a year to write, because it had already been written. So we have seen this before. I'm not commenting on, the W3C. It's very hard to work in that kind of committee level, I know, because I've done it for several years now. And sometimes it's really hard to sort of please everybody. And so I think that, I think that WCAG Silver or WCAG 2.3 maybe might address these requirements, but WCAG 2.1 was definitely trying to meet a whole lot of additional requirements, low vision, cognitive disability, et cetera, that, mobile just perhaps didn't get as much focus as it needed. So, and this is something that a whole lot of accessibility companies have been involved in. We really want people to use them. It's available under Creative Commons. So take them, repurpose them, send me emails about what works and what doesn't work. We'd love to hear from you because, we've put a lot of time into it, but, we want to know if we did something wrong. Thank you very much for your time. I'm right on time. I must admit it is 2:45 a.m. in the morning, so I'm going to go watch the finale of Mythic Quest, which is very, very good if you're in the tech industry, which I think you probably all are, and then go to bed. So I probably won't see you much at the Drupal GovCon, but please reach out to me through Hopin or send me an email, and yeah, love to talk more about how things are going. Talk to you soon.